welcome to Unlearning Economics. So I have with me once more Professor Jo Michell from the University of West England. So thanks for joining us again, Jo.
Oh, thanks for having me on again.
Yeah. So the reason I wanted to speak to you again, and for those who didn't see, we spoke about all things Keynesian economics, I think last time, as well as a bunch of other stuff. But this time the focus is going to be a little bit more narrow because recently in academic times, so a little bit ago, you released this report on austerity in the UK and the effects that it's had. So I'm really excited to discuss that with you today. And so let me just start by let's go back in time. So can you take us back to 2008 and the years after 2008, because I want to know how the global financial crisis kind of transformed. And somehow after this banking crisis, austerity seemed to emerge as the number one economic and political issue in the UK. So how did that happen?
So 2007, 2008, we had the global financial crisis, which is old news really now to a lot of people. People like me, it was very formative. It was a really important part of my sort of economics education and experience. But to a lot of people, it's something which is in the history books. So the global financial system, particularly the North Atlantic financial system, melted down, required huge amounts of government and central bank intervention just to keep the banks, giving out money at the cash machines. Pretty much, there were these warnings that the cash machines were going to be shut down overnight if
I remember that, yeah.
Emergency measures weren't taken. It really was unprecedented and I think scary in many ways. And many policymakers found it, very, very alarming time. The immediate response is the standard Keynesian response to a crisis, particularly a credit crisis, where the reaction of people who are over indebted and need to spend less to try and cover their debts, the reaction you get in that situation is a very clear demand contraction. You get a halt of spending. So there's a straightforward Keynesian solution, which is fiscal response. The government needs to step in. And in the first instance, that was what happened. And Gordon Brown, who was Prime Minister at the time, sort of has credit now for leading a global coordinated response. When I say global, I mean sort of rich nations, the US, Europe, the UK. And that was the initial strategy, was this fiscal response. But that turned, full circle, 360, when George Osborne became Chancellor with David Cameron as Prime Minister. They formed a coalition government in 2010 in the UK with the Liberal Democrats. And they came to power on a story about there being no money left. There being big deficits, which was true. The debt to GDP ratio having risen very sharply, which was true. It had happened and it had risen sharply, partly because GDP had fallen substantially as a result of the financial crisis, partly because of the government interventions that were required. What wasn't true, and was a story which was repeated again and again and again by Osborne and Cameron and the people around them and the media who relayed the story, and even in the end by the Labour Party, was that the crisis was one of Labour overspending, that Labour had in their time in power borrowed too much and spent too much. And the data just don't support that. If you look at the debt to GDP ratio over Labour's time in office, it was slightly lower when they left office. It was slightly lower when the financial crisis hit than when they took office. And the big, sharp increase really was the result of that shock. So that was the narrative that was around at that time was, okay, we've done the emergency care. Now we have to do the sort of long-term fixing. The fixing the roof while the sun is shining is the classic David Cameron statement, which of course is pertinent at the moment as we see the roofs of the schools across the country crumbling.
I saw that getting retweeted today. Was that the reason? Because actual roofs are crumbling. So his 2013 tweet about fixing the roof while the sun is shining has been retweeted widely today.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why it's at the front of my mind, because of this schools concrete crisis, schools that have been woefully underinvested, along with huge amounts of the other infrastructure of the country. I'm sure we'll come to that as a result of austerity. We've now literally got crumbling roofs in our children's schools. Famously, Cameron described what the coalition austerity program was going to do as fixing the roof while the sun is shining. We could do with fixing the sun in media terms, of course. Yeah. But that's, again, we'll come back to that. So that was the story, is that, we've spent too much. We've run up the credit cards. Everybody knows that if you spend too much, you have to then spend less in the future. You can't run up debts indefinitely. All these kind of crude narratives comparing macroeconomics to households were dutifully relayed by all levels of the political and economic establishment and press. And it became completely entrenched logic that the thing you have to do is cut the deficit, reduce the government debt. And there's always a jump here, which we'll come back to. The way you do it is by cutting government spending, by reducing government services. Sure. There was a widespread belief that there was just excess in government. There was, spare fat that should be trimmed off. There was inefficiencies. All of this stuff could be done without causing trouble. And these guys were going to do it. And this would set us on the path to renewed prosperity. So I think that's roughly the kind of story which Osborne took power on and really hammered for a decade or so afterwards, almost. You still hear it.
He's still hammering it. I listened to a podcast. He went on, is it Alistair Campbell's podcast? And I think it's Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. I forget the name of their podcast. And George Osborne was on it. And he was still very much setting his tram lines about austerity and how it had been needed and how it had been successful, in fact, which I guess is part of what you debunk in the report, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a group of the people who were around at that time, including Rupert Harrison, for example, who was Osborne's advisor. Now he's a BlackRock senior person, and certain people in the media who were connected with that group who relayed their messages are still really pushing the story that period was a period of success. And it's mostly now a story about the growth experience from about 2010 to 2016. Of course, the Brexit experiment makes it difficult to, economics is unscientific at the best of times, but anything close to a controlled experiment goes out the window when you get the Brexit referendum. So you've only really got that 6-year period, but they repeatedly trumpet, highest GDP growth in the G7 and things like this, which aren't strictly true. I mean, it was close to the top of the league, but it wasn't the highest, at least following recent revisions.
No, and you're comparing yourself to the Eurozone as well, right? Which is obviously had a lot of problems over that period. So if you're saying that, then it's a bit of a low bar.
Right. Many of the countries you're comparing yourself to had austerity. In the Eurozone, they had the Eurozone crisis plus quite extreme austerity. Italy, in particular, has got the most incredibly sort of alarming GDP trajectory. I always sort of wonder if I should just take it off the bottom of charts because it just, it makes the y-axis so much longer because it's down into the negative bit of the territory. Yeah, so if you do more sensible comparisons, either historical comparisons or cross-country comparisons with better comparators, you get a less rosy story, even on this very crude comparator of GDP per capita growth, real terms, 2010 to 2016, which is the one thing which they always just repeat over and over again.
I think, in terms of myth busting, there's a fair amount of it in this report. I think one thing that I have seen out there is the idea that austerity itself was a myth. It didn't actually really happen, because I think if you look at something like government spending as a percentage of GDP, it tends to be quite slow moving. It sort of trends upwards over time. It might flatline, but it doesn't. I think if you just looked at that graph, and I stress I actually should have looked it up before this, but I don't have it to hand. But I have seen people point to that and say it doesn't suddenly go down. There's no real austerity. But in figure 3 on your paper, you look at real government spending per person, right? Now that very quickly stops going up. It was going up all the way through the 90s and 2000s, stops going up, and then starts to plateau and then actually go down between sort of for the decade from 2010. So there was quite harsh austerity, clearly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This story that austerity didn't happen really doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and I think few people really seriously try and make it. Some of the austerity proponents and say, well, capital spending didn't budge that much and recovered But as you say, we've got this chart, real public spending per capita, and it's a very steady increase throughout the new Labour period up till 2010. And then there's almost a 90-degree angle in the chart, and it declines. Now, I suppose devil's advocate would say, okay, well, by the end of the period, it was still higher than the beginning of the period. But that kind of discontinuity in a growth rate or an increase is going to have serious effects, particularly in an aging population which is increasingly reliant on care, a population which has faced underinvestment in infrastructure for a long period, since the 80s at least, if not longer. So the idea that you can have an increase and then just cap it, or even put it into decline without causing serious repercussions, I think doesn't stand up to scrutiny. The other thing that's worth, I think, emphasizing is that the way the cuts were distributed was very skewed. So they claim to be protecting health, education, pensions in real terms. It's a little bit of smoke and mirrors. And actually, if you look at John Byrne Murdoch's got some pretty good charts on NHS spending and so on, and even those took a pretty serious hit, at least in increased terms rather than absolute level terms. But what that meant was things like local government, mental health support, social care, support for young people, training, schools, parks, recreation, that stuff really got hit very, very hard. And I think the social consequences of that are something which we're now watching unfold. One thing about austerity is that it hits at lots of different levels. We argue a lot about the macroeconomics, debt to GDP ratios, growth, employment, sort of almost instantaneous or 6 month, 1 year kind of effects. But if it's done through spending cuts, these things have effects which I think can last, generations. I really think there's a group of people who've lost a generation of their cohort almost as a result of austerity. There are lives that just will never be fixed, and it's really, I think, quite upsetting in many ways, that the some of the social effects that are still unraveling.
Among them is this return of stunting, isn't there? In some parts of the UK, I saw children in schools were so malnourished that they were actually stunting, which is pretty incredible, because that's usually reserved for poor countries today or Britain in the 19th century, but it's come back.
Yeah, these kind of really, horrible physical health indicators are fairly clearly showing up now, and the structural break and the time when the series changed direction, mortality as well, from about 2010, it's quite clear. And I saw also that study about children stunting, and the one of the people who was involved in the analysis of the data said it was very clear to him that it was a change around 2010, and he thought it was to do with austerity. Right. But I think one thing worth mentioning as you raise it is this idea of the UK as a rich country is questionable, because inequality is so high, particularly in geographical terms, but also in income and intergenerational terms. Really, we're a pretty poor country. If you look at the lives of the poorest in the UK, they're comparable with GDP per capita countries much lower, Eastern European countries and so on. We've got these small pockets of economic dynamism, high technology, high productivity, nice incomes, white collar, leafy neighborhoods and so on. But there's big parts of the country are really very, very poor. So the average, as ever, hides real disparities there. And again, I think that's something which austerity really, New Labour, for all their faults, and there were faults certainly, did push things in the opposite direction in many ways. Many of those indicators, those social and poverty indicators, moved in the right direction under Blair and Brown, and they very clearly went into reverse again under Osborne and Cameron. Was
the amount that Tories paid contractors who were their mates to deliver various public services, did that go down, or did that stay the same, or possibly go up?
That's a good one. I don't have are you talking about just the pandemic scandal, or over the whole period?
In the pandemic, I think it's definitely the case that it was was well over. I was just wondering about before that even. I was wondering if there was actually austerity in that area, because somehow I doubt it. It's often opaque. This is actually a funny thing, isn't it? Because not funny, ha ha, but when you look at the books, you'll find that, all this talk of the government budget is a little bit of a fiction sometimes, because you already mentioned capital versus current expenditure, which is one way of sort of, you don't count capital expenditure like investment in railways, for instance, right? But then also there are a lot of things which you find are just off the books, and I think the kind of gifts to Tory donors via contracts that they don't deliver on, often those aren't quite on the books in the same way as like spending on schools.
Absolutely. I mean, the problems of public-private initiatives, as they were called, much of it introduced under Blair and Brown, the New Labour years, where the idea is that some kind of public guarantees are made, or some kind of contract is made with a private corporation. So then it looks like the infrastructure spending is done in the so-called private sector, but then the government is hooked into these horrific long-term contracts, which are just, bleeding the public sector, charging them insane amounts for, a basic meal or something. Once you've built a building for the children to eat in, then you're locked into some contract with Sodexo or one of these other contractors which produce the food, and they charge, for a meal that should cost £3 or something, they charge the school £9, and they can't get out for 10 years. So in the end, the public end up paying more for the actual capex, the capital expenditure, than they would have done, but it's all hidden through this contracting stuff. And of course, this kind of stuff is, as you're suggesting, rife for corruption, and that came out very clearly in the during the pandemic. My colleague here at UWE, Daniela Gabor, is starting to do a lot of work on this idea of the de-risking state, and how should we think about that balance between direct public investment and the state assuming risks as a way of incentivizing private capital to step in.
I'm speaking to Daniela in a few weeks, actually.
Great. So in the context of the green transition, it's a really difficult one, particularly in global terms. I mean, my own view is probably that quite a lot of de-risking is absolutely inevitable for something like a climate transition. But Daniela, I think, is quite rightly pointing out many of the nefarious side effects of badly designed de-risking policies.
It's the rabbit hole goes quite deep, doesn't it? It's difficult to overstate how bad these contractors are in the UK. I think like there've been so many cases of just outright failure. Carillion, G4S spring to mind. I forget the names of the people who provided PPE or notionally provided PPE in the pandemic, but they were also absolutely dreadful. It's just they're pure giveaways. So let me just so it's fun to have a go at the Tories, but let's just acknowledge that this report doesn't just do that. Actually, it kind of counters the Keynesian view that you and I think, both held at the time. So would you like to explain like what that view was? You already kind of did before, but maybe explain, how it went wrong and how it got it wrong, and what actually happened.
Sure. So around 2010, I think there were broadly two opposing views. There was the Osborne-Cameron view, which we've already talked about to an extent. Another aspect of their view was that their austerity program would deliver growth. It would be an expansionary austerity program, meaning higher GDP per capita. And the way that they argued this was going to work was twofold, really. First of all, by reassuring the financial markets, you would calm down bond investors. They would be increasingly willing to finance government debt. Interest rates would be lower. That would allow the Bank of England to keep interest rates lower, and that would have a stimulus effect. And broadly speaking, the low interest rate story was true. The stimulus effect, I think, is much less compelling. It was quite clear that even the Bank of England themselves, although they weren't really allowed to say it, were between the lines by the end of 2014-15, were saying quite loudly, we cannot stimulate any harder. We've cut interest rates to zero. We've done huge amounts of QE. The economy is still not growing, in terms of productivity. Inflation is still below target. So that bit of the expansionary austerity story, I think, didn't come to pass. Another part of the story is sort of confidence effects, the idea that if public finances are out of control, at some point the government is going to slam the brakes on by raising taxes in the future. So if we cut government spending now, that'll reassure the public that they're not going to be hit by tax cuts in the future, and that'll keep them spending. And these two effects, sort of financial markets expectations of tax rises and general confidence effects were the story that people like Cameron, Osborne, Matt Hancock made repeatedly in favor of the expansionary austerity idea. Now, Keynesians like myself said, no, this is rubbish. We all know that in the face of demand contraction in the following a financial crisis, as I said, the private sector, households and businesses will try to repair their balance sheets. They will be spending less. Spending less means lower incomes. Lower incomes for business, lower profits means layoffs, means higher unemployment. Then you get spirals whereby people lose their jobs, they lose their income, they spend less, and the economy kind of moves down into a negative doom loop until it finds some new, let's call it an equilibrium, but a higher unemployment, lower GDP, at least in growth terms, and so on. And so this was the argument made against by people, including myself, but much of I think the progressive left in this country, standard Keynesian arguments about we'll have a big recession, we'll have high unemployment, sort of Great Depression type outcomes. And we got it wrong, because you look at the headline macro figures, GDP per capita growth, unemployment, the employment rate, and so on, and they don't match the predictions made by either group. So in a way, what we're doing in this report is going back and telling another story about how we think austerity affected the economy. And it's neither the Osborne Cameron expansionary austerity story nor the sort of straightforward Keynesian recessionary tendencies story.
Yeah, it is really interesting, because like we said, obviously the growth wasn't that impressive, but it was growth, and it compared favorably to the G7 for whether or not that's a good comparison group. Employment was also quite high. I think that was one of the bigger things that they trumpeted, right? So it wasn't a Keynesian recession. It just wasn't. There were hints of it. I think early on, if I'm remembering correctly, there was like 1 quarter of negative growth, which didn't technically qualify as a recession or whatever. People were talking about a double dip, but it didn't really materialize. So, I mean, the mechanism you isolate is that just it mostly happened through the labor market, right? That's what you're talking about. So, yeah, no. First, could you explain that mechanism? Then I'll ask you a bit more about what the Tories thought of it.
Yeah, sure. On the growth thing, let's just make one final point, which is that from 2010 onwards, growth per capita was broadly comparable with some of the other G7 countries. And as we've said, there are problems with the comparison and so on. However, the collapse from 2007, 2008, the pre-crisis peak to 2010 was much steeper in the UK. We fell much further than the US, much further than Germany. So if you plot a long run series starting, say, 2007 GDP per capita, UK comes out much, much worse. It's the fact that from 2010, from the point of when austerity was imposed, all the countries grew roughly equivalently, but the UK had basically lost 5% of GDP at that point. And there's endless arguments about whether so-called potential GDP, had the supply side really permanently lost 5% at that point? And I would argue it hadn't. So to give the Keynesian argument its due, I do think there could have been a lot stronger growth. I think growth could have been a lot better with a different policy. The Keynesian policy prescriptions of the time, I think, were correct and wouldn't have led to inflation, overheating, and so on.
It's funny, isn't it? Because we see it even now. It's kind of the idea of a recession, even though it's obviously a kind of arbitrary definition, not entirely arbitrary, but somewhat arbitrary, right? Why isn't it 1 quarter of negative growth? It could be, right? That's negative growth, right? That could be a recession. Or if you have a situation where, growth was 4% and now it's 1%, then that's a really big dip, isn't it? And people are going to notice that that's a massive decline, but it's not a recession. So you do have that kind of difficulty of just the media only report really when it's a recession, or they only go insane about it when it's a recession. But you can still have big dips in GDP that don't technically count as recessions, but are obviously experienced
And you can have
slowly.
flatlining real income for much of the population for 10 years, and
Sure.
it doesn't figure in the media discourse. It's all about whether GDP is up 0.1% this month or down, and it's mostly meaningless
Yeah,
noise.
exactly.
I get ever so frustrated when I get asked to go on the media and they ask me to comment in depth about 0.1%, subject to revision numbers from the
Yeah,
this month, and you
quarterly
really
GDP.
want to say, yeah,
The variance is
something
enough
sensitive.
that it could be negative or like quite highly positive. You know what I mean?
That's
It's
right. Yeah,
time series relationships and aggregates, like you just can't comment on them at that granular level. You need to wait
yeah,
and look back.
exactly. So you say to them, well, look, this is going to be revised by 100% within the next 3 months, so we'll all forget about it. And then they just say, oh, well, thank you very much. Goodbye, sir.
Yeah.
The last thing we want you to say.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's come back to the question you asked me about this mechanism. So let me read you a quote from R. Danya, who is one of the academic proponents of expansionary austerity. Alesina was probably the most high-profile figure, but there's a group of 2 or 3 of these people who are publishing quite a bit around this period and before 2008, arguing that austerity itself could have expansionary effects. And they were quite clear. They said this: consider a fiscal stabilization that relies on cuts to public spending. A decrease in government employment, in government wages, and in unemployment benefits can have positive effects on the economy because it makes the labor market less tight. Any decrease in these public spending items lowers pressure on the equilibrium wage with positive consequences for the economy. Now, that's lovely technical sort of economics language, but if you translate that into English, what they're saying is, if you have strong government spending cuts, reduced employment in the government sector, pay cuts for government workers, and generalized slack in the labor market as a result, you're going to get wage cuts. You're going to have a big shock to labor bargaining power.
Yeah.
Workers are not going to be able to say, give me a pay rise. They're going to have to take whatever they can get, and they're going to be squeezed. Now, they jump from there, from the normative to the positive in classic economist style, to this is good for the economy. This has positive consequences for the economy. Never mind that the economy is made up of people who work and need incomes. If we cut those people's incomes, then it's good, because, so they argue, it's expansionary. So not only was there a third mechanism, it was actually quite clearly stated, although neither side spotted it, I think, or publicized it for fairly obvious reasons. Cameron and Osborne weren't going to say, hey, we're going to do this because it's going to give you all a pay cut. And I think the Keynesians didn't think through perhaps the implications of the so-called flexible UK labour market. So what we argue then in the paper, as you say, employment didn't fall. And in fact, it reached record levels. If you take employment, number of people employed as a share of the working age population, for example, it was above 75% and has never historically been above those levels. It rose almost steadily from the beginning of austerity in 2010. It dropped sharply as a result of the 2008 crisis. It kind of flatlined for about 18 months, and then it actually recovered sharply. And this is the other thing which the austerity proponents will always point to and say, look, we produced a miracle in the labor market. Now, what we say is the flip side of this is what happens to income, to weekly pay, to hourly pay, to real household incomes. And from exactly the same point that you get this explosion of hours worked, you get falling average real weekly pay. And what we think that explains this is really this big bargaining shock to labor bargaining power shock meant that people really saw the opportunities for decent work stripped away. People found their incomes in many cases declining because their wages were being cut. As a result, they had to respond by increasing their hours of work. And we think that the flexibility of the UK labour market is such that in general, people could find something. They could do Deliveroo driving, or they could work in an Amazon warehouse, or they could find a 0 hours contract doing something or other, almost inevitably at minimum wage. If you look at the demographic composition, for example, of the groups who expanded their employment during this time, one of the largest groups is women with dependent children. And I would argue that that's a group who almost certainly doesn't need to work more hours. They want to be looking after their dependent children. And a likely explanation is that these people were having to work more hours simply to put food on the table for their families. So we think that with hindsight, what happened really was negative bargaining power shock meant that real wages took a hit. Employment was then able to increase. And as we've said, demand was actually relatively weak. GDP per capita growth wasn't great. So you've got, weak GDP historically compared and to an extent internationally compared, alongside a big expansion in employment, in hours worked. And then that you're going to have an effect on the residual. If you've got increasing hours worked, but effectively output flat, GDP, let's call it flat, growing very slowly or growing much more slowly than the increase in employment, you're going to have a collapse in measured productivity, or at least a collapse in the growth rate. And that's exactly what we see from 2010 onwards. You get this incredible structural break, the 20 or 30 year trend of almost continuous steady productivity growth just goes dead flat, and it still hasn't ticked up since 2008. Well, what are we on now? 15 years later or something. And this has been discussed, at length as the so-called productivity puzzle by economists focusing on technology, education, all the usual supply side factors. We actually think it's quite straightforward. Productivity is a residual. It's not something which is, embedded purely in people's educational capacity, that how well educated they are, their so-called human capital, the capital stock, technology. Of course, all these things matter, but particularly in the shorter run, it's effectively one number divided by another. It's output per hours of work, and if hours of work increase without output really changing very much, or only changing very slightly, because so many of the new jobs created are these low productivity service sector sort of menial type tasks, then you're going to get a collapse in measured productivity. So we think that you can kind of put all of these headline macro indicators together and tell a fairly coherent story about what happened in the labor market, focused on the labor market during that austerity period.
It's really interesting that, because I find a lot of the discourse around the productivity puzzle quite frustrating, because I suppose maybe this is my bias, but it kind of started when austerity started. And I know we need to be a little bit more careful with our empiricism than that, but it was a massive change. And then people were sort of trying to talk about skills, education, total factor productivity, all of these things which I think are quite amorphous. And the concrete measures of education, for example, I don't think they really changed in that period at least. And it just seemed to me quite clear that austerity had somehow hit productivity. But this is quite an interesting mechanism, right? Basically, if people become Uber drivers, there's not really a gain in growth from that. It's just one of these service jobs that has quite low growth, low productivity potential, and so as the labour force shifted into those types of jobs, you just saw a collapse.
Yeah, straightforward. I mean, as the number of high tech and good manufacturing, what's left of it, there is still some job growth basically flatlined, and the expansion of jobs took place in these kind of menial service sectors. The average is going to show you a flat or falling series. So I think that's fairly straightforwardly what happened.
I mean, you hinted at this earlier, and in the report it's interesting because Osborne was the vaguest about his policies for the labour market, right? And yet you're identifying it as the main mechanism which drove austerity and the effects of austerity. Was it all part of some kind of evil plan, and he knew that this was going to be the effect of austerity, or did he just sort of get semi-lucky with the effects it had, and he was completely wrong about it? I mean, what's going on there, do you think?
That's a very good one. I think there's two things going on. I don't think he thought the labour market mechanism was going to be the one which generated the charts that they could point to and say, with hindsight, we got it right. I do think there probably was a hidden agenda or a hidden sort of motive or whatever. And I do think that there's a big part of just cutting the state going on with people like Osborne. And one thing I find very frustrating about discussions about austerity, fiscal policy, fiscal rules, and so on is they're always framed in sort of technical terms of debt to GDP ratios and fiscal responsibility and fiscal rules and macro, rather than straightforward size of the state. As you were saying earlier on in the discussion, look at things like government spending as a share of GDP. And I think it's quite clear that Osborne wanted to reduce that because, of course, he could have used taxation if he really was worried about the deficit and the debt, but didn't want to, cut social spending and so on. He could have raised taxes. And I think, ideologically, that's not where these people are coming from. So I do think there's a sort of hidden agenda. And I think that hidden agenda is still very much in place at the moment. Try and, cut as much of the state provision as possible, push it into the private sector. At the moment with problems in the health system and the education system, people will move towards private provision. People will move to private education if they can afford it. They'll move to private health, and then they'll say, "Well, look, this is what the market wants. We're just helping you out because this is what people have shown us what they want." And then you can start dismantling the NHS and further degrading the education system. But I think they probably did, to a degree, believe their own stories about confidence, about bond markets, and so on, at least to the extent that those stories allowed them to come on the TV and present some kind of credible story. Osborne, of course, was very taken with the Reinhardt-Rogoff 90% debt to GDP threshold. I think in some House of Lords hearing, he was asked, what's your intellectual sort of foundation? What's your intellectual inspiration? And he cited Reinhardt and Rogoff as this is the centerpiece of my intellectual sort of foundation for my program. Of course, that paper's now completely discredited and is used as an example endlessly of when economists do bad things. So I think it's a combination of ideological opposition to the state, effectively, plus finding a story which worked, which was the one about confidence, bond markets, and sort of avoiding tax rises in the future.
Yeah,
I'm guessing
it's tricky. Getting out of certainly my expertise and maybe yours as well, but you wonder about the kind of more general, kind of what Gramscian stuff about class ideology and whether they sort of had this self-serving narrative and that basically engaged in class warfare. That's what a lot of people say, right, against Labour and the poor, however you want to put it. They were following Kalecki's political aspects of full employment, essentially, right?
Yeah, I think you can see it quite clearly in those terms. I mean, there's a famous quote from George Osborne that sticks in my mind where somebody said something to him and he responded saying, "Well, I don't know anybody who earns less than £100,000 a year." So I think he is very much from those circles. Those are his people.
That's absurd. I remember he said once, because there was the pasty tax, you remember, of the various things the coalition messed up, but it was they were taxing Greg's pasties, not entirely deliberately, just by virtue of a silly policy that they were ignorant of. And George Osborne said, "I can't remember the last time I had a Greg's." And I was thinking, my God, like everyone I know, has had a Greg's in the last year, and I'm not a working class hero, you know what I mean? I'm a middle class guy. Yeah. But still, I know loads of people, LSE, where I worked, would go to Greg's. You know what I mean? It's not, you have to be in the upper class to not eat Greg's, like in this country. It's a middle class and working class thing. Everybody goes to Greg's. It's great. But they're so shielded, these people.
Yeah, no, you have to be from a certain strata to not be aware of the significance of Greg's as well, even if you don't eat there yourself, not to understand it's a piece of the UK infrastructure.
Yes. Yeah.
I had a friend who had a job delivering cars around the country. We would take him to the most far-flung places that most of us would not get to, all in through our lives, see whole bits of the UK, in a whole sort of day. And he said that he would rely on Greg's constantly as a sort of food source. And he said one thing he noticed was that, particularly in deprived areas, there was a sort of almost unwritten rule that people would get fed in Greg's. People would get, leftover bits and pieces, and people who hadn't got money could come in and get something to eat or a cup of coffee or something. I'm sure there's no, policy or something which you could find on a piece of paper, but it's a bit telling that that's where we ended up. This is almost like the sort of shadow welfare state, something like Greg's.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, when somebody like Osborne makes the mistake of hitting that bit of the welfare state that absolutely everybody knows and sort of relies on one way or another.
I mean, it is this bifurcation, right? Because, I mean, it's like David Cameron did have this idea of the big society. It's easily forgotten. But again, it's an example where I think it chimes with your report because in a way he was kind of successful, in air quotes, successful, because things like, that Greg's unwritten policy, for example, expanded after austerity. Food banks expanded after austerity. Now, lots of left-wing people will point to that as a failure, right? And I do agree. But if you see them as wanting to increase the charity sector, so the poorest go to charity, while the other side of this, what you mentioned, the bifurcation that I'm talking about, is the middle class and the richest start to go private with their health and education, right? Then what you have is the welfare state is then doing much less, right? And so that is a success for them in terms of their own aims, even if we think that, it's bad, which is really interesting. And maybe we haven't grappled with that enough on the left. Maybe we haven't grappled with those dynamics. We just sort of assume that food banks are bad and we don't try to, I don't know where I'm going with this, but try to understand, the role they're playing. That was the aim of the Tories, right?
Yeah, I mean, food banks are not bad. Food banks are good and essential.
Yes. Yeah.
But the situation where people who are nursing people for 12 hours a day in intensive care need to rely on a food bank because they can't afford a tin of soup on the way home from the shop or whatever is not good. But you're right. There are big, difficult questions about sort of selfishness versus helping out in your local community. And I do think since the 80s, since the Tories, really, we've been almost conditioned to be a more self-centered society, consumerism and, having your own nice house and going on holiday or whatever. And there's a tension there with the sort of, as you say, the big society looking after those who are on the wrong side of austerity. But the left generally does tend to, treat charity as, the worst option in many ways. You want the state to provide, and I'm absolutely on board with that. But it's a difficult one. There's some interesting long-run cultural dynamics going on, I think, at the moment, which, feeds into all the story about Brexit and, the left behind heartlands and, why is Keir Starmer currently apparently focusing more on, people with perhaps prejudices that we wouldn't be comfortable with as his voter base rather than his traditional left voter base. But that kind of moves us somewhat off topic.
Yeah. I mean, but it is the outright failure of the economy, right? And then you get sort of culture wars nonsense, and you get also the reliance on charity and philanthropy. I mean, it's a very American thing, and I do think we're heading towards something like the American system, but possibly worse, because it's going to be really sort of unplanned, and health, the NHS, is in crisis, and I think will just be perpetually in crisis, and then we'll have sort of private healthcare emerge, and we'll have, it'll be really under-regulated at first, and I'm sort of foreseeing this whole thing, but I really feel like it's set us down a really bad path, austerity.
Yeah, and I think people probably maybe younger people in the current environment may be less aware of how much of the current bad situation, I think, really does go back to that period, because it is, as we said, it's history now. It's quite a long time ago, and many people it won't be in living memory. But I do think, more than Brexit, more even probably than the pandemic, austerity is the one thing I would point to which really has brought this country to the current very miserable state of affairs, and I think made it particularly incapable. During the pandemic came at a time when much of the infrastructure was, hugely underinvested in. The healthcare system was already facing problems, whereas austerity was a choice. The pandemic was imposed upon us, and there's going to be more with climate change. If we're going to get onto the depressing stuff.
Yeah.
the kind of supply shocks, I think, which we saw during the pandemic and the reopening, I suspect are going to become more frequent occurrences as a result of climate disruption, crop failures,
and we're not preparing for them, right? I mean, this is the thing. This is the false economy of austerity, right? You're not. It's like the stunting in children, right? But in a more general sense, you're not making the long-term investments you need to be able to cope with various supply shocks.
Exactly. You're making short-term gains in headline financial indicators, which are not particularly meaningful. And you've got a whole bunch of policy tools to manage. I mean, we could come back to what could you have done differently? Because that's something else we do in the report is give a bunch of counterfactuals. What was the alternative? But in doing that, you're just building up more and more problems for the future. And most of these problems are going to require government spending one way or another. If you take away mental health support and youth clubs, you can have an increase in mental health problems and crime. And that's ultimately going to end up in more police required, more violence, more imprisoning. As you say, the attempt to cut the state doesn't work very well. It just moves the spending around, and it moves it from things that you do want to things that you don't want.
It's really interesting.
Worse problems further down the line.
Because I spoke to Alex Vitale, who's the author of The End of Policing, the sort of figurehead book for the defund the police movement, and he talks a lot about this. Because again, to go back to America, what you have is the police are serving a lot of social functions that they shouldn't necessarily be. So I think when people hear defunding the police, they often kind of get the wrong idea, because what you can do is, you have police doing things like they're in hospitals, they're in schools, they're present in schools as a matter of course in a lot of neighborhoods, right? They're attending mental health calls, domestic violence, all these things that arguably police aren't trained to do and shouldn't be doing. And in America, obviously, the police, all they really know how to do is pull their gun out because they've had like 2 weeks of training or something. But like it's just, you're still spending money. You're still spending state money on it. It's just a much, much worse solution to these social problems. And they're not going to go away just because you cut the state budget. I mean, that's the purpose of the welfare state, right? That's why we need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I do think defund the police is an unfortunate name. It's a bit like degrowth. It's one of those things which doesn't accurately represent the idea which is underneath it, and therefore turns people off, almost from the name.
I agree. I'm tempted to get distracted and talk about both of those things with you, but I won't, because I do agree on that. So let's actually, you mentioned this modeling exercise that you do, right, about the counterfactual and like the amount of money that would have had to be invested and how this maps onto some of the budgets for health, and we've got things like the nurses strikes and how we could pay for it. So could you maybe talk us through that?
Yeah, so these exercises we've been doing for a while now, where we try to show some alternative, and they're very difficult, partly because of something called the fiscal multiplier, which is, I'm sure some of your listeners and readers will know what I'm talking about, is the idea that when the government spends £1 million, it'll have some effect on GDP. And some people would argue, okay, you spend £1 million and somewhere else in the economy, somebody else will stop spending £1 million. This is a so-called crowding out story, which I think is now widely discredited. You can find it in economics textbooks from the 90s and 2000s. The idea that every time the state spends, the private sector scales back, so you have no effect. So that would give you a multiplier, so-called, of -1. For every dollar you spend, you lose $1. At the other end, you've got ideas that when the state spends $1 million, that's $1 million or pounds. I keep switching currencies. Let's call it pounds. In people's pockets, they're going to spend more. That's going to have sort of spiraling effect through the economy, and you can end up with, for every million you spend, GDP increasing not only by that amount but by more, by 2 million or 3 million. So you could have multipliers of 2 or 3 in that case. So when you do these exercises, you've got to come up with some story about this. And technically it's a bit fiddly because do you have the increase just for 1 year? Do you have it what we really know about fiscal multipliers, I think, is that you get a fairly solid short run effect, and then it kind of fades out. So a step change in government spending will give you a little boost in growth, and then that boost will kind of fade out. So we try to keep it simple, and we just say we'll go for what's called a balanced budget increase. So rather than trying to model increased deficit spending through the multipliers into GDP, which gets you into big arguments, because then all the people who try to disagree with you say, oh, no, well, no, you've overestimated multipliers and your impulse response functions are too optimistic and so on and so forth. So what we said was, we'll just go for a straightforward balanced budget multiplier in which if the state expands its spending by $1 billion, GDP will increase by £billion. GDP will increase by £1 billion, but we'll match that with taxation of $1 billion. So you get government spending $1 billion higher, taxation $1 billion higher, and GDP increases by the amount of additional spending. So that's called a balanced budget multiplier scenario, and we had a multiplier of 1. And we think that's relatively conservative. There's quite a lot of empirical evidence for these kind of magnitudes. I actually think that you could argue for bigger deficits and higher growth. But you put this in and you sort of plug in government spending below the new Labour trend, but significantly higher than the post-austerity start. So you kind of split the difference. And what we find is that you can get about a £91 billion difference in spending relative to the austerity outcome in this balanced budget counterfactual by 2019. And that's a significant chunk of the NHS budget or the education budget. I mean, 91 billion is a big proportion. Total public sector spending is of the order of 900 billion in that period. So you're looking about 10% bigger size of the state in that period. We don't think that the bond markets would have, balked at this. It would, in meaningful terms, it's not going to have any real effect on the size of the deficit and the size of the debt. In nominal terms, because it's balanced budget. So for every extra pound of spending, you got an extra pound of taxation. So the pound size of the deficit is actually equal to the same period under Osborne. But in terms of GDP, you actually get an improvement. You get a slightly smaller debt to GDP ratio at the end of the period because your GDP is higher. So you end up with 3 percentage point difference in public debt to GDP at the end of the austerity period. Of course, the austerity period wasn't successful in cutting debt to GDP. They did think they were going to get substantially higher.
It's worth remembering that is a big fact.
Yes. Osborne repeatedly said, by this point, I will have debt to GDP falling, or by this point, I'll have balanced the current deficit. And he missed every single one of his targets. He didn't get the deficit into surplus at any point over the austerity period. He was relying on Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts, which had much more optimistic outturns for growth than we got. So even though they do point to the growth record and say, look, we had relatively good growth compared to what they said we were going to get based on this kind of expansionary austerity story, it was much, much worse. So debt to GDP didn't really come down under the austerity period. In fact, by 2019, it was higher than in 2010. And so we argue that with say 10% higher government spending by the end of the period, you could probably have marginally lower debt to GDP ratios, but a much more substantial increase in government spending, and therefore, avoiding the sort of the severity of the cuts that we've seen. And I think it's quite a conservative scenario. I actually think there was enough slack in the economy that you could probably push it harder. The reason we didn't show these kinds of more optimistic scenarios is that people attack them more strongly. If you give a relatively conservative story, but still show social differences, substantially better social outcomes, which you would get if you hadn't closed all these facilities, then it's much harder for people to push back against it, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a good choice that you do, a multiplier of 1, because it's it's difficult to object to that. Compared to if you did like one of 1.5 or 2 or something, people would be all over it, wouldn't they? So I agree with that choice in the report, but I also do think it's conservative. And I mean, there's a whole literature about demand-led growth, right, as well, that's not really within the mainstream of the profession, or it wasn't until maybe slightly more recently. But you could be looking at kind of productivity effects. I mean, look at the USA now, right? They've had quite an extensive not only stimulus but also public investment, industrial policy, really. And I think what you're seeing the beginnings of that kind of level of demand-led growth now there. So it really can be much more successful than the report would predict.
Right. I think you actually open up a really interesting discussion, which maybe isn't one for now, but for another time, which is now the time for these kind of demand-led strategies? Because I do think we're in a very different world to where we were 2010. Labor markets are much tighter, employment rates are much higher, and we've got the climate crisis. We've got these supply shocks. The US, I think, has demonstrated that, the sort of Keynesian argument that the supply side does respond to the demand side, and you can have much better labor market outcomes in terms of employment and wages. They have demonstrated it, and it's through policy, really, rather than, I think, the economics profession coming round to a better understanding of that relationship. But at the same time, while you might expect me to be kind of like, fully cheering, I do feel that there's been a narrowing of the terms of what we should be aiming for, and so-called full employment has become, an overriding policy aim, to the point that almost everything seems now to be off the table in terms of broader social goals and so on. And the other side of this is the question of, to what extent can the US do this because it's the US, because it can effectively run deficits of any order of magnitude, and because it's the dollar issuing country, it's never going to get into any kind of financial trouble. I do think countries like the UK don't have the same degree of flexibility either in the financial markets, although they have much more than people like Osborne and Cameron suggested. Probably also on the supply side, I think we are going to be more reliant on imports, and the degradation of the sort of supply side in the austerity period does mean it's much harder to run the economy hot in that way. And then you add to that the climate shocks, and I feel increasingly pessimistic actually about what I would have argued 15 years ago, which was a very strongly demand-driven response. But I think in sort of theoretical terms, it's been proved that that mechanism is there, and it does function. But now we need to think of it in terms of how much can we use it without hitting these kind of supply-side barriers.
I mean, this does lead me to a question I wanted to ask, which is, to what extent do you think that what happened to the Liz Truss government kind of proves your point there, and maybe even slightly rehabilitates austerity, because they did engage in a kind of fiscal stimulus, and things just went to shit, and they were the shortest serving government in some time, because the bond markets absolutely panicked, and it was just madness. So do you think that shows that we do have limits on government spending and stimulus?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting and tricky episode. It's split people in interesting ways, because the branding of the Truss story was all about the supply side. We're going to stimulate entrepreneurial spirit with our tax cuts, and this will lead to investment and so on. It was very obvious, and I said it at the time, that it was a Keynesian stimulus package aimed at winning an election. They were trying to generate a short-run sugar rush kind of boom into an election as a way of winning that next general election, and it went badly wrong because they tried to do this at a period of high inflation, at a period when the bond markets were jittery, labor markets were tight. I think it neither proves nor disproves it to an extent. One interesting thing about it is that at least some of the US progressives, the ones who have been pushing very much for this kind of demand-driven program in the US, were very much on Truss's side. They were arguing, well, look, there was no real supply side limit. The bond markets weren't really reacting to fiscal profligacy. It was to do with technical issues to do with the Bank of England, and the Bank of England could have, once it stepped in, it proved that it could calm the bond markets. So actually, and now interest rates are back to where they were during the Truss period. So some were saying, well, look, it wasn't really Truss's fault at all. It's just part of a secular trend in interest rates. So some on the left did end up defending Truss as a way of
Oh, hello, everybody. Are you all still with me in the chat? Because I think Joe's just dropped out of the call. Thank you, NG Spy. I'll yeah. Let me write this down for Hobby the time, because I need to cut this out of like the repurposed episode. Well, and for myself as well. Okay, good. You're all still here. How we doing? Yeah, the bond market claimed Joe as well as he was speaking about it. The bond market revolted and he got disconnected. So you really cannot go against financial markets. It will always result in problems. Let me just have a little look at my chat with him. And I wonder what's happened. He's at his university. He should be back. He should be back, everybody. Don't worry about it too much, but yeah. He rage quit, yeah. He did. He got well angry. Hey, can I move this down? It's too high. My camera's too high. Soy Master. Oh, God. Good name. A quick catch up. Austerity was bad in the UK, but not for the straightforward reasons we think, because it didn't result in a standard sort of Keynesian recession. What actually happened was that it reduced the bargaining power of labour, which forced people into very menial service jobs, Deliveroo being the prime example, and therefore employment was actually very high, but GDP growth was positive, but it was low, and productivity growth was low because people weren't being employed in the kind of useful growth enhancing sectors, and also they could have pursued more expansionary policies without any cost to the government budget, and also while probably creating higher GDP growth and fewer social consequences, because the social consequences of austerity have been truly terrible. Here he is. Hello, Joe.
Sorry, I left you there briefly.
Yeah, we're all waiting with patience, but we're still live on the stream. So people were saying that the bond markets claimed you when you cut out, because you were criticizing them. So it seems like really nobody is safe.
Yeah, the bond market fury took me. Do you know what happened? This cursed computer I'm using seems to just go onto a screensaver if you don't wiggle the mouse regularly enough.
It's one of those.
Yeah, I got into a monologue and then I suddenly realized I was on screensaver mode and it turned everything off.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah. So to cut a long story short, I can't remember where I got to before I got cut off. The idea that this proves a kind of Reinhardt-Rogoff threshold, beyond which public spending can't increase or deficits can't increase, I think is straightforwardly wrong. I do think a government which put forward a sensible long-run investment plan, much of it debt-financed, but explained why it was doing it, how it was going to do it, what it was going to pay for, and got, for example, OBR projections alongside it, did it through the usual sort of parliamentary routines, whether we like them or not. They're sort of part of the ritual at the moment. My hunch, and of course we don't know, but my hunch is the bond markets would swallow it. You wouldn't get the kind of jitters we saw during that period. But I do also think that it is a reminder that it's not without limits. There is this MMT view that basically they're made up numbers. Things like the deficit and the debt have literally no relevance other than in the sense that they're showing you how much you're spending, in the real economy and so on. And I just don't think that's true. There is a limit to which people want to hold your liabilities, whether that's banknotes, bank deposits, bank reserves, or bonds. And at some point it'll show up. If it doesn't show up in the bond markets because the Bank of England steps in, people can sell the currency and your currency will depreciate, and then you have to spend more on imports, and that makes you poorer.
Unless you're America, that's the caveat.
Right. So that's the kind of question which I raised previously is, can the Americans get away with this kind of demand-led policy in a much more aggressive way because they are America? And of course, there are big debates at the moment about, is it the end of the dollar? These debates have been going on since the 70s at least. Zoltan Poshar from the Perry Merling Poshar axis has caused excitement by going against Merling. Merling's very much, I take the same view as Merling, but the dollar's here to stay for quite a bit longer. But Poshar's been proposing the end of the dollar and a multipolar world in which the Chinese yuan and so on become reserve currencies on equal footing and this kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm skeptical.
I don't those kinds of debates. It's like the BRICS debate as well. I'm just like, I just sort of switch off with it because I'm like, I feel like this is a very narrative driven type thing that's not particularly grounded. I just I don't really like, the rise of the BRICS or the end of the dollar or stuff like that. I'm like, no, you've just made up a nice sounding acronym. It doesn't actually mean anything. There was one other thing with the Liz Truss government, which is, I'll add it to the list of things I should have actually looked into before I asked you this question. But there was a very idiosyncratic problem with pension funds, wasn't there, for the Liz Truss government? I don't know if you remember the specifics of it, but it was something very particular they did that frightened the pension funds, which frightened the markets, and that could possibly actually account for the whole episode.
Yeah, so there was this thing called liability-driven investment, which is a particular kind of hedging strategy used by the hedge funds, by the pension funds. The short version, I think, is that when interest rates go up on government bonds, it's good news for the pension funds because they make their money effectively by having pension liabilities they have to pay out and holding financial assets. So when the returns on the financial assets increase, it's good news for them. However, because they're hedged, meaning that they've sort of taken bets against big changes, when you get very sharp increases in interest rates, it actually means they have to cover margin. They have to find cash quickly. So even though long run they're in a better position, short run they have to come up with cash. And the way they do that is by selling assets on their balance sheet. And those assets, of course, are those long run government bonds, 30-year sort of maturity. So you get a self-reinforcing loop where price of bond yields falls because people are selling them. That pushes the interest rate or the yield on those bonds up. That triggers more margin calls from the pension funds, so they have to sell more bonds. So you go round and round in a circle. Yeah. And this was happening simultaneously with the Truss fiasco. We got the initial jump, I think, as Dario Perkins coined it, the moron risk premium, the sense that the markets just suddenly thought, okay, the morons are now in charge. I don't like to look at this. So the yield just jumped as people.
Their vast incompetence, their obvious incompetence, should not be underestimated as a factor.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, just the sense of these people are just going to do whatever the hell they like without thinking it through, purely driven by sort of patronage group views, sort of Institute for Economic Affairs, Tufton Street madness. Is a different thing to Sunak, Osborne, Gray, miserable austerity, by the book, by the spreadsheets. So they are two different beasts, I think. And it was a sense that this is sort of populist right crazies.
But both her and the Chancellor were hilariously insane. It did seem to me at that. And maybe I shouldn't use that word so disparagingly, but that some of the things they came out with, not just while they're in government, but across the years, and they just, I don't know, they didn't seem to be on it. And I think I don't blame bond markets for panicking when two people who are that incompetent are at the helm. I mean, I read Liz Truss's defense of her policies in the Telegraph. Did you read that? Because she wrote something a few months ago.
Yeah, I think I did see that. Yeah,
it was quite well written because she went to Oxbridge, so people like that can produce, they can produce a decent article. But she was just sort of saying we didn't know about the pension thing, and it's like, well, you should have.
Yeah, you should have thought before you moved. So ultimately what happened was the pension funds were short of cash short term, and the Bank of England figured this out and basically knew it. So what they said was, we'll buy the bonds off you. We'll do it at a penalty rate. So it's we're going to slap you on the wrist for getting into a position where you need help. So if you like, kind of budget lender of last resort type of operation. And they said, we'll do it for 2 weeks only, limited time offer. And this, again, really split opinion. When I first saw it, I thought, this is insane. This is like throwing petrol on a burning house, saying, lender of last resort, but only for 2 weeks. Because I thought at that point that the sort of financial mess was more widespread. I actually think with hindsight, the bank had calibrated it pretty well. They had worked out, they'd spoken to the pension funds, they'd worked out what was needed. Towards the end of the 2 week period, the pension funds weren't coming forward and taking the the penalty offer because they didn't want to take the slap on the wrist. So Mervyn King came out and gave this speech where he said, you've got, I can't remember what it was, 3 days left, and I mean it. We're turning taps off this special bond buying program. And people interpreted this as trying to stoke a financial crisis to bring down a democratically elected government. And again, you saw this interesting coalition of Tufton Street people and people on the left sort of saying something similar. This is monetary dominance. This is the central bankers, unelected central bankers, bringing down a democratic government. As it turned out, this is my view, and others, all over the place do disagree. I think they roughly got it right. The pension funds did show up the next few days. They came and took the slap on the wrist. They handed over the bonds. They got the cash. That was enough to halt the doom loop.
Yeah.
The bond market stabilized and the bank was able to get out. But by that point, Truss and Kwarteng were toast and they were finished. And it's, there was that FT Alphaville thing of Mervyn King in the Iraqi, I think it was the Iraqi spokesman who always used to wear sort of military fatigues and tell crazy stories during the Iraq War. I think they put Bailey's face onto his body and had this, sort of, it's a coup, basically. Maybe I've got the wrong person. Anyway, it was basically a sort of, military fatigues version of the governor. It's a coup. So there's endless debate about, was it a coup? Did it really need to be, if the bank had done their job in a sort of MMT sense, they could have just carried on indefinitely. Who would have cared if there were these numbers going up? So it's a really interesting case in point, I think. But to cut to the chase, no, it doesn't prove the Austerians right. And it also doesn't quite prove, I think, the other side right, as ever.
No, it doesn't prove the what you might call vulgar MMT right, perhaps, shall we say. So let's, a couple of people in chat have been asking, because we're talking quite heavily about the UK, right? And obviously the report's centered on it. I think we've covered some general arguments for why austerity is bad, but I was wondering, to what extent do you think your analysis, the mechanisms that you identify, the labour market mechanism, does that apply to Greece or any other country in the rich world, in the poorer world? What do you think about that?
It's a really good question, and it's something I've been asked a few times, and I hesitate to give an answer because I don't know. I haven't gone back and looked.
That's not allowed. That's
Sorry.
not allowed, that answer.
Okay, I'll make something up for you. I haven't gone. I'll probably come to an answer once I've said I'm not going to. I haven't gone back and sort of looked at the data series for, say, Italy, France, Greece. Having done this exercise and sort of thinking about this way of looking at it. But what I would say is that during the Eurozone crisis, when austerity was imposed, there was always this story about so-called structural reforms. The Austerians would always say the problem is inflexible labor markets. We've got dual labor markets. You've got a relatively small number of protected peoples in long-term contracts making good money, and then you've got everybody else who can't get a job because the sort of unpleasant distributional effects of these dual labor markets. So what we really need is flexible labor markets in France, in Southern Europe. We need to take away labor protections. Arguably, we already had that flexible labor market to a much greater extent in the UK when austerity hit, and that was able to allow this expansionary austerity through a bargaining power shock to take place. I'm sure that there were bargaining power shocks in the rest of Europe. But I think the specifics of the labor market in each place will tell you something about the outcome. And I don't know enough about the specifics in each case to really be confident. I spoke to a guy from Italy, and he said that he hadn't thought of this mechanism, but once he looked at it, it felt very reminiscent of the Italian experience, not just since the Eurozone crisis, but even a sort of longer run Italian stagnation. But I haven't had a chance to really go back and
I mean, with Italy, the first thing that comes to my mind, and now I'm just making stuff up, but like there's probably a much stronger informal sector in Italy, right? So you might have that playing the role of the Deliveroo drivers, right? If you had a kind of austerity, you might have people backing out into the informal sector, and something similar probably applies in spades for much poorer countries where the informal sector is actually the majority of the economy, right? And yeah, you can imagine that. You can imagine austerity taking people out of the formal labour market into the informal sector, but the dynamics of that would be very very similar. Sorry, but obviously the statistics would be much more difficult to gather than in the UK.
Right, we have almost a sort of formalized dual labor market in the UK, where the minimum wage, to an extent, does bind, and you get this huge clustering around minimum wage, and so people who are sort of knocked out of decent employment do almost have a kind of safety net in the sense of, crap jobs at minimum wage. And as you say, in many countries, that split between the sort of protected, decent job sector and the genuinely, informal sector is much more pronounced. And once you get to developing countries, emerging market economies, and poorer countries, all of huge amounts of development economics is about that issue. 70-80% of the workforce will be in the so-called informal sector. So, yeah, I think you need to look at it carefully. Greece, of course, is a special case, both because of the scale of the sort of pre-austerity boom, the absolutely catastrophic scale of the collapse. I mean, it's orders of magnitude difference. And the way the mechanism is going to work are just not going to be, this kind of thing. It's going to be much more direct and much more brutal.
No, I mean, yeah, Greece is it's just completely changed the country, like the level of public services, if you can even call them that now. I mean, I told anecdotally, but somebody who lived in Greece said to me, if you go to where they live, if you go to a doctor, you have to provide your own hospital bedding and stuff like that. Like, you have to bring it with you, right? They don't have. Right. They might have the bed, but they don't have the bedding. Right. And it's just sort of it's basically just a doctor in a room, maybe with a bed in it and like a desk, and that's a hospital, right? Wow. Which is it's just so the scale. You're right. It's the dynamics are probably entirely different. I mean, is there anybody who's looking at that in as much depth as you looked at the UK?
I don't know. As I said, I'd quite like to go back, because there was a huge explosion of literature on the Eurozone and austerity and the crisis. But I think a lot of it was very much through that sort of Keynesian lens of high-level macro indicators and predicting sort of, depression-type outcomes, which you did see in places like Greece. Italy arguably has been in these kind of long-run, almost depressionary tendencies for since the 90s. Sure. At least, youth unemployment indicators are very high. But then you've got somewhere like Ireland, which does exactly the opposite. Ireland is, booming in many. I mean, there's huge inequality. Yeah. The headline indicators are completely impossible to read because it's all, corporate profits being recycled. And so the GDP and GNP are off by
if you want to talk
30
about
percentage points, something crazy.
Statistics, Ireland is the example. The GDP jumped by 20% because Apple relocated there or something, but it wasn't real. It was just
exactly. They have an office where the whole of the corporate profits for tech sector for Europe is funneled through 3 buildings in Dublin and Cork, and it's added to GDP despite correlating to absolutely no economic activity. So you just cannot use Irish GDP figures for anything meaningful.
Yeah, but they have. I mean, it's interesting actually, because to ask you, are there success stories with austerity? Do you have places with expansionary austerity where it kind of worked? Are there conditions maybe you could identify under which austerity might be justified?
It's a good question. My hunch is that some places are damaged less by austerity than others, but I struggle to think of cases where you wouldn't have got better outcomes without the austerity. I mean, people will point, for example, to sort of free market shock experiments where countries had big bloated public sectors, so lots of white elephant stuff, industrial strategy was going badly, there was populist policy, deficits were out of control, and the only option was to come in and get inflation under control, make cuts. And after a while you do get a sort of recovery. I mean, some people point to some Latin American countries, for example, as examples of kind of right-wing centre-right policies, putting the country on the right track. My hunch is that sometimes some of the diagnosis can be accurate, but you can solve the problems that are there in ways which are much less socially painful, and without much of the negative consequences in terms of worsening income inequality, wealth dynamics, and so on. So my hunch is that austerity I think part of the question is that austerity in one sense is a technical macroeconomic thing about stabilizing debt, out of control debt to GDP dynamics. And on the other hand is brutal cuts to government services. I think you can and do have to stabilize debt dynamics sometimes. Countries do get into situations where their debt is just out of control and it has to be fixed. However, I can't think of many, or if any, examples of cases where serious cuts to public services, particularly public services used most by those at the bottom end of the income distribution, the most vulnerable, will do anything other than hurt people who should not be hurt. So I would separate those two things, and I would say, fiscal consolidation can be done because you can tax the rich, right? You can find more equitable ways of paying for the things that you need to pay for. And I think we were sort of talking a bit earlier about sort of cultural shifts and charity and so on. One thing that just seems to be impossible to say in public debate at the moment is people need to pay more. There's lots of people who are pretty well off. They've got 2 cars, they got a nice house, they have 3 holidays a year, they change their kitchen once every 3 years. We don't need those people to be able to do that. What we need is schools to have roofs that don't crumble. But it's become culturally very, very hard to say that, but politically people don't want to say it. So in that sense, that kind of austerity for people who have private jets and big boats, I'm all in favor of. But austerity for people, who just, trying to make ends meet, I'm not. But these things get very mixed up into it, as I said, with sort of so-called technical macro discussions and so on. I do think the climate crisis is going to impose a kind of austerity, and we have to have a discussion about where it falls. Who's going to take the hit in terms of consumption.
Well, it's like the Ukraine, right? The war in Ukraine and how that obviously negatively affected the amount of energy and increased energy prices. Clearly, we have to consume less energy, right? At least in the short term. That's obviously, so we have to have austerity in terms of energy. But who does that is what's up for debate, right?
Absolutely. Is it people who are heating their stables and their private swimming pools, or is it people who are having to drive 50 miles a day because there's no public transport system, and simply to get to their only place that they can get a job, they have to drive a car, right? Those people can't be forced to suddenly reduce their fuel consumption unless you provide an alternative. So this gets into all the discussions about just transition and so on. But I do think that the Ukraine shock and the pandemic reopening shock is probably a dry run for what's coming in terms of the next 20 or 30 years of probably rolling supply shocks and inflationary outbursts. And we're going to have to be really thinking carefully about how we respond to it. Probably the sort of cruder, just run everything hot, big deficits, big spending may not stand up to that kind of an environment in the way that it would have been very much the right thing to do, I think, probably from 2010 onwards.
Yeah, it is a really depressing thought. The sort of path dependency, right? Like now we've sort of bugged it up, and we might be looking at declines in living standards for a lot of the population over the next few decades. I mean, so far, I don't want to jinx it. We've got through 2023. There's obviously been some really severe wildfires and things, but it hasn't. It seemed like there were just constant, massive events, for a few years. But now it seems like there hasn't been one for a little bit. But I do dread to think what the next one is. What's going to happen next? That's just going to cause a decline in living standards again.
Yeah, we don't know. It's all probabilities, and the models of the climate effects are hugely uncertain. My view on this is that the worst outcomes are catastrophic. So even if we think the risk of those worst outcomes is relatively small, we should be reacting to them. We should be treating them as within the bounds of this could happen, and you've got to take action to prevent it. If you want to be a bit more positive. When you look at the distribution of responsibility for carbon emissions, and you look at the distribution of wealth and income, suddenly the fact that you might need to cut consumption doesn't seem so bad, because it's really, 50% of global emissions come from 10% of the population, and it holds within countries too. It's the top 10% within countries rather than top 10% of countries. So top 10% in China emit far more than the average person in the UK, for example. So I do think a sort of radical egalitarian policy, which I'm in favor of for a whole bunch of other reasons, would also have very positive effects, or would reduce, let's say, serve to offset the negative effects of the climate crisis.
I think taxing the rich, it's a climate necessity, isn't it?
Yeah, and this sort of comes back to your question of, can austerity ever be a good thing? Post-war, we had austerity in the UK at the same time that we had basically the foundation of the welfare state, the formation of the NHS, and then big expansion of government services. Yeah. So I do think that if we expand it to mean, genuinely we're all in this together, you can have sort of egalitarian policies in which we collectively try and figure out which things we can do without, which things we want to do more. But if we try and do it the way we have been doing it, by just pushing all of the pain of adjustment onto those who are least able to take it, then we're stuffed.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you mind answering a few questions from
not at all.
Chat? So G Russell, so this is a two-part question. G Russell says, what constitutes out of control debt? Or more specifically, is there an unstated understanding of the MMT distinction between currency issuers/users, or is it something else at play?
Good. Okay, two questions. Let's tackle the first bit. What constitutes out of control debt? Nobody can give you an absolutely straight answer on that. There's no meaningful threshold, even for a single country or, cross countries. You can't say it's 90% debt to GDP, 150. Japan's been chugging along at 250 for a long time now. No real problems. Much poorer countries can hit 30, 40%, and the bond markets take flight, and they're in the hands of the IMF. In simple mathematical terms, there's a relationship between your primary deficit, that's the difference between government spending and government taxation, excluding interest payments. So you're put away the financial side, just how much you're taking in on tax versus how much you're spending. There's a relationship between that, the current size of your debt, the growth rate, and the interest rate. And one thing which we've argued in other reports, this fiscal black hole report, one thing we argued was actually the deficit isn't that much of the story, at least in the short run. The growth rate and the interest rate are much more powerful, particularly when you've got a big debt stock, because as the interest rate goes up, if you've got a big debt stock, that suddenly pushes up the amount the government has to spend on interest payments. Conversely, if the growth rate can increase by 2 or 3 percentage points, that can have huge effects on the size of a debt stock you can sustain and the size of a deficit you can sustain without increasing debt to GDP dynamics. You can find configurations of these variables that are quite plausible for many countries where you do get a long run exponential, sort of explosive debt to GDP process. That's, I think, what we mean ultimately by unsustainable. The Office for Budget Responsibility does publish regularly these 70-year charts where it currently shows, if everything stays the same as it currently is in the UK, you will get this, catastrophic exploding chart. And then the FT publishes articles saying UK public finances are unsustainable. It's meaningless noise because it's all premised on the fact that nothing changes over the next 70 years. No policy is adjusted, no tax rate, no growth rate, anything. So I think they're completely meaningless. Yeah. I genuinely think we need much more role for judgment in government on these things. We need committees of sensible, non-partisan people, from the Bank of England, from the Treasury, from the OBR, from the Debt Management Office, also from the Climate Institutes, from Low Pay Commission, that come together and take a careful look at the data and say, how worried should we be for the next 6 months, 2 years, 5 years? What can we do about it? And, when things, if you know that your primary deficit is going to be 3%, if you think interest rates are going to be 5% and growth is going to be 2%, you've got a problem. You've got to change something. But it's a judgment call, and it depends on where you are in the global currency hierarchy. It depends on what your inflation rate is expected to be, and so on. So I think there's the sort of wise people approach to economic policy making rather than a rules-based approach is something I'm currently trying to argue in favor of. So that's the first bit of the question. Currency issuers versus currency users. I don't find this distinction particularly useful because I think it's too crude. I would say the only true currency issuer of the planet is the US at the moment, the dollar. Everyone else is somewhere on a spectrum, from purely externally imposed upon, dollarized countries, those very poor countries at the bottom of the currency hierarchy who nobody wants to hold their currencies and therefore cannot import anything unless they export an equal amount and do all the transactions in dollars, through a spectrum to countries like the UK and Japan, which are right towards the top of the spectrum, big financial markets, widely seen as relatively safe investments. Their governments are held as safe assets globally, not just nationally. Those countries can get away with much more in the sense of issuing their own liabilities without ultimately the effect showing up in the exchange rate and therefore the costs of their imports. You're only a currency issuer, in this MMT sense, either if you're the dollar, you're the top of the tree, or you're in complete autarky. If you close your borders, then sure, you're a currency issuer. You can do whatever you want. North Korea is probably a currency issuer. But beyond that, I don't think it's a particularly useful distinction. I know a lot of people make a lot of it, but I think the reality of the world is that it's messy. And once you're in a globalized system, you have international financial markets, you're import and export reliant, then you're in an international world, and you cannot, by definition, then be a currency issuer because there are other currencies out there which are going to affect you, other interest rates out there which are going to affect you.
Right. Thank you. Another one from NG Spy says, with developing nations, how does one balance the problems of the balance of payments encouraging greater policies of austerity due to a lack of FDI with development?
Right. So we talk about problems of austerity in countries like the UK, and then sometimes I go and look at, for example, South Africa. I was asked to have a look at South Africa's fiscal indicators. And there you do, I think, see something which I would say is straightforwardly unsustainable. You look at the combination of interest rate, growth rate, primary deficit, size of the debt stock, and even in the short run, you're inevitably going to get sort of exponential debt dynamics. And you're talking about a much poorer country, a country with the most horrific levels of inequality. And it's absolutely horrific to be a person who's on the call saying, this is fiscally unsustainable. You cannot just run bigger deficits to generate public works programs, to put people into employment, to build the housing that people desperately need. So in that sense, you're facing, a much more difficult constraint. Countries are lower down the currency hierarchy. Their productivity is lower. The supply side is much less developed. The infrastructure isn't there. The potential to do sort of demand-led policies, to run the economy hot, to just get people straight into work as quickly as possible, sort of things like public guaranteed employment programs, I think is much more limited in those countries. And people would argue very strongly the opposite. People like Fadel Kaboub have argued that ELR type policies, employer of last resort policies, are very useful in developing countries. I've argued against this. I think, come down to the international monetary system and debt relief and liquidity provision. You look at the proportions of debt interest payments which go externally for the poorest countries to rich countries, and I can find no moral path to seeing that can be acceptable.
Yeah.
And so I really think that ultimately it has to be an international settlement which gives these countries the financial space to allow them, if you like, to act more like currency issuers than currency users, if you want to use that distinction, and give them the policy space, because it's externally imposed to a substantial extent, as well as internally driven by underdevelopment, lack of infrastructure. So to overcome those problems of internal underdevelopment, I think that the richer countries have to provide the policy space in terms of financial and monetary mechanisms to allow them to develop the infrastructure and develop the productive capacity and increase employment, probably only gradually, but in a sustainable way, while cushioning the blow for as much as possible for those at the bottom. But, we can't have a sensible conversation about distribution within the UK, let alone a conversation about global equity and reparations, for example, about past excesses and so on. Current debates about whether we should be giving aid to India because, India have put a space rocket on the moon or whatever, so therefore they're not deserving of aid. I disagree with that, of course. So while the solution to me is fairly obvious, the political economy of getting to it, I find it impossible. I mean, how can we move the conversation to a sensible place where we actually try and support poorer countries to do the things that they need to do?
Yeah, the global system is, even before you get into critiquing kind of global markets and the method that we have of financing governments, I think the international institutions are very clearly rigged against the poorer countries. Like, that's something that I just think needs to be corrected. And again, that's before you even talk about historical reparations, right? So Jimmy asks, now I have no idea about this question, so I'm not sure if you do. Could we implement a version of the Virgil currency, spelled WORGL with the two dots on top of the O, I forget what that's called, and demurrage? Do you know what that means?
I think I'm going to have to pass. I do feel like these terms are familiar, but I'm probably going to start answering a question about stamp script when it probably refers to something completely different. I suspect it's a monetary arrangement that we've come across, but we don't immediately recognize it from the name.
I don't know, Okay, so how does Jo think austerity relates to the rise of so-called non-majoritarian institutions? Do institutions insulated from democratic pressure lead to bad economic policy, austerity in particular?
What do you think is meant by non-majoritarian institutions there? What do you think the question is getting at?
Are we thinking about like everything from, I guess, like the IMF and World Bank and the EU at certain times, or maybe the European Central Bank, the central banks, maybe even the OBR, the IFS, which you do mention in your report, maybe these kind of independent technocratic institutions? Maybe that's what the question's getting at.
So is the question asking, does austerity put more power into the hands of these?
Does it, or does it lead, in a more general sense, maybe, do these institutions lead to bad economic policy like austerity?
I see what you mean. I don't think there's a straightforward relationship. I think it's quite possible to envisage technocratic institutions which are at arm's length from directly elected politicians that could produce quite good policy outcomes. So I think we've got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you like, to say that, because independent central banks, for example, were a feature of the austerity period, therefore independent central banks are the sort of core of the problem, or the root of the problem. At the moment, one thing I'm thinking about is proposals to try and adjust institutional structures to allow better macro policy making without just going back to putting it all in the treasury. The traditional way of just saying, the chancellor picks the interest rate, the chancellor does everything, the treasury does what it's told. There were obvious problems with that. I don't think problems with that were necessarily the ones that were highlighted at the time, so-called dynamic time inconsistency, real business cycle stories about how you can't trust politicians to run fiscal and monetary policy because they always try
some bullshit,
do populist stuff in the run-up to elections. That's part of the story. But I think there's a much bigger question about good judgment-based policy making. But I do sense perhaps a bit of an overlap in discussion with the sort of Trumpist or Johnson Brexit Farage populist story about how technocratic, educated elites, the university lecturers and the woke people are really the problem here, and that they're connected to the World Economic Forum and the central banks and the people who made the vaccines, and a sort of populist push from the right against structures and expertise and so on, and it makes me nervous. So I think we need to look at fixing the things we've got rather than wholesale rejection of some of the checks and balances and institutions that we have.
Yeah, Zach M wants to clarify that he's definitely not on that side, but I used to be more anti those institutions, and I think unfortunately because of what it morphed into, I've backed away from that a little bit, even though I'm not entirely happy with them, to say the least. But
right, I've been a strong critic of organisations like the OBR in the past, but once you see those arguments coming out of the GB News anchors night after night, I start to feel queasy about singing the same song.
And then
so we have to
always
look for different ways of putting the case for better policy, which is ultimately what we're trying to do here, right?
There's usually some anti-Semitism eventually as well, if you look at.
You don't have to go many steps to get to white supremacism with a lot of stuff.
Literally, it's disturbing thought, but completely true. So by the way, the Vorgel, if I'm pronouncing it right, is a currency which has an expiration date, I think.
Right. So I think it's what's called stamp scrip. Which was an experiment which has been used a number of times to try and prevent hoarding, to try and stimulate demand by giving people cash, which if they don't spend it wears out. A few people in the UK have proposed it. I think maybe George Monbiot had a Guardian article. Do you know what? I think I even wrote a letter to the Guardian about 10 years ago responding to George Monbiot proposing a stamp scrip system for either the UK or Greece. It was fashionable for a while during the Greek collapse for people to suggest parallel currencies and stamp scrip type arrangements. I mean, all of these arrangements are aimed at either increasing liquidity, when the IMF and the European Commission and the central bank are refusing to refinance debts and therefore sort of forcing these deflationary tendencies as people try and immediately scale back. You do want liquidity provision. You do want to let people push the problem into the future. Stamp scrip is partly about that. It's about introducing an additional source of liquidity. It's also about, by having this expiry date, prompting people to spend, so giving a kind of demand stimulus. I think you can produce the same results, better liquidity management and better demand management through more direct mechanisms. I'm not convinced that these kind of monetary fixes, which people get interested in, and I understand why people get interested in them, because they're very interesting, these monetary proposals, going all the way back to people like Gazelle, and Keynes was interested in lots of this stuff. But I think we've got better tools to achieve many of these things. And many of the problems we face now, perhaps not the same problems of sort of depression era illiquidity that we were facing when some of these proposals were designed.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good answer. I think we got to the bottom of it. Hopefully we answered the right question. So I'll give you the final question, which has been asked a couple of times. So No Name, No Surname asks, what are the long-term effects of austerity in first world countries on infrastructure?
I sort of feel like just sort of gesturing and saying, this building I'm in is still standing, but
the computer that turns off if you don't move the mouse.
That's right. The 5-minute break in the
stream, yeah,
in the Zoom call. I mean, I think we're seeing it, but it's transport which is clearly not fit for purpose and can't be upgraded to match the climate crisis. It's an energy provision system which is not fit for purpose and can't be upgraded to match current challenges. Schools crumbling, hospitals in disarray, motorways melting, you name it. You underinvest in infrastructure, you kind of get away with it for 5, 10 years. You can kind of put sticking plasters on, but ultimately you get these sort of tipping points where everything just seems to be going wrong at once. And I think that's what's all around us. And the problem is it takes as long to fix it. We start fixing the infrastructure now. It's not for another 10, 15 years that people really would start thinking, well, actually, things are working a bit better. And unfortunately, the electoral and the political cycle doesn't work on that kind of time frame. So the incentives are all misaligned to actually get those things done, particularly when the press is full of incoherent stories about needing to fix the deficit and the debt as the first priority above everything else, endlessly parroting silly stories about austerity and so on. But I think it's just that straightforward. Everything is broken, and it's it needs fixing, and it's not getting fixed.
Crumbling infrastructure. I remember it was not an exaggeration in the United States for a long time, and probably still isn't, but I feel like they're going towards fixing it, whereas here we're going to see much more properly crumbling infrastructure outside of London. London will probably be okay, but in the rest of the country, I think you're just going to get roads that are almost unusable eventually because there's just so little investment.
I think a huge amount does depend on what an incoming government might do in the elections next year. Now isn't the time to open that particular can of worms. But there is the possibility, I think, still of some sort of change in direction, economic direction. But
I hope so.
Let's see. It remains to be seen.
That's an optimistic note to finish on. Thank you, Jo. It's been really interesting, and I think we've covered quite a lot. But UK austerity in depth, but also a lot of other things. So thanks for coming on the podcast.
Brilliant. Can I abuse your platform to give a plug to our thing on Thursday? We've got a full day of discussion at the University of Greenwich on austerity and deprivation with people like Danny Dorling, Rob Jump, myself, Victoria Stadheim, and it's open to all. So if anybody who's listening to this is around on Thursday and wants to hear more and hear sort of broader perspectives on how this intersects with things like deprivation and talk to us, then do come along and hang out.
Yeah, that looks really interesting. I'm going to try and come along. I might be able to come. Rob Jump's a co-author as well, isn't he, of the report?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And that's at Greenwich University in London to repeat it. Yeah, should be a good event.
Great.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for joining, and I'll see you all at some point very soon.